Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Dr. Marc Lamont Hill and Todd Brewster, the authors of Seen and Unseen: Technology, Social Media, and the Fight for Racial Justice. Between them, they've written more than 10 books, at least by my count. I tried my best. Hill is a host at BET News, a professor at Temple University, and the owner of a bookstore. Brewster has worked in broadcast and print news and has also taught at Temple University as well, and also co-wrote several books with the late, great Peter Jennings. Thanks so much for being here to both of you for our first show with two guests.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
We're happy to be here, yes.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. If a Black person is killed by a white supremacist, but no one is there to record it or document it or spread the video online, did it happen? It most certainly did. But as Dr. Hill and Todd Brewster argue, the evolving means by which those videos and indeed those facts have spread have defined how the fight for racial justice has proceeded. Whether by artist rendering in the 1700s or by viral video in the 2020s, they argue that media is responsible for both building segregation and injustice and for bridging those gaps. Dr. Hill, I'm going to start with you. What does it say about Black life in America that it took a democratization of media and power for many aspects of Black life to be finally revealed?
First of all, thank you for having us, and please call me Mark.
I'll try. You've earned it, though.
Yeah, you know. I think for me, it really speaks to the value of Black life in America, not just at the level of what happens when we die, not just when the state is an agent in our death, but a bigger question about the way that we value Black experiences, Black stories, Black testimony. You know, Black people have said for years, they're killing us, and it has not mattered. Black people have cried out about police brutality, excessive force, et cetera, forever. And people never took us seriously. When we scream Black Lives Matter, and I'm not talking about the organization, I'm talking about as a broader cry. When we say that Black Lives Matter, it's not just about what happens once we're mutilated. It's about saying that our stories matter, that our knowledge claims matter, that our experiences matter. And too often they've been ignored. And what the media shift has allowed for is the end of innocence, the end of a steady stream of Western narratives that say we didn't know. If only we had known. The truth is they did know, but now these cameras, these videotapes, these live streams, they don't let us off the hook anymore.
Your book traces the history of injustice in America from the beginning. It catalogs the impact of media on numerous instances of lynchings, police shootings, riots. We've covered many of them on our show as well. In particular, though, it focuses on that of George Floyd. So, Todd, why did you decide to not just gloss over his life and go right to, let's say, just go straight to the horrendous death that he endured, but you chose to explore numerous turning points that Mr. Floyd faced before he wound up underneath that officer's knee? So why did you try to give a full picture of George Floyd's life?
Well, first, again, thank you for having us on. I think it's important that we recognize that as special as George Floyd's death was in both its horror and in the reaction that it created, drove people to the streets, it created a protest movement that lasted for months. It was known the world over. As special as all that was, and that was one of the things we mine in the book, why is it that created that kind of reaction? George Floyd lived a very ordinary life, a life that is repeated by many men and women Black men and women in America in the 21st century. The life that he lived growing up in Houston in Third Ward, the poverty that he lived with, the broken family that he came from, the dreams that he had for being a rap artist, being an athlete, the pattern of his of drug abuse, the petty crime, all these paint a picture of a life that was really marked by America's story with race. I mean, one of the things that we point out is not only the story of George Floyd in great detail, but as we do, we mark all the echoes that there are in his life of America's racial history. The gutting of downtown Houston for the interstate system, for instance, in order to bring people from outside the suburbs, that destroyed the economy there. The lingering associations with the Confederacy that existed in Houston and exists in so many parts of the South continue to sort of have the drumbeat of the Civil War.
I thought it was amazing that both the housing project he grew up in and the hospital he was born in both told the story of racism in America just from the way they were named. I should have written the names down, but that was amazing.
Yeah, the CUNY homes and the even the churches around in the Third Ward reflect the echoes of the Civil War, of slavery, of Jim Crow, for that matter, of Reconstruction, and then the promise of Reconstruction, and then the horror of that Reconstruction devolved into.
Every once in a while, something, when you're reading about racism in America, something hits you and you go, I never knew that. And I've read hundreds of books in here. And this fact knocked me truly off of my feet. I wasn't standing, but you get my point. The history of racism and segregation in Minneapolis. I'm a lifelong baseball fan, and I had never heard that about the Minnesota Twins, that their owner brought them there, Dr. Marc, because there was a relatively small number of Black people in the city, and their owner preferred the Minnesota Twins to be playing in front of more white fans, than they had used to play in front of, I think, as the Senators. That is that is crazy, and I never heard that, and I've seen millions of Twins games probably. How did the racism in Minneapolis impact George Floyd, both while he was alive and then after his death? But that fact about the Twins blew me away.
I must admit that factoids about baseball are often Todd's. And
I'm also a huge baseball fan.
He's a huge baseball fan. I'm in Philadelphia, where we haven't had a baseball team in years. But no, it speaks to a deeper problem. Part of what we tried to do in this book consistently, I think, is show how racism isn't just an act of individual ill will, how it's not just a blip on the screen, how it's not bad apples, but how it's baked into everything that happens. And within particular spaces, whether it's Texas, as we talk about George Floyd, whether it's Minnesota, as we talk about George Floyd, and Minnesota, as we talk about George Floyd, we're talking about structures and long-standing structures, things that are that appear neutral, agnostic even on the question of race, but are actually deeply indebted to racist practices, white supremacist ideals, nativism, etc. And the baseball example or the public housing example are just two of many examples of how we're sort of surrounded by it. And so by the time George Floyd shows up, and this is the important piece, I think, is that by the time George Floyd shows up and walks into a store, just like by the time Mike Brown, we could talk about, shows up and steals a cigarillo in Ferguson, or by the time Trayvon Martin is walking down the street in Florida with his Arizona iced tea. By the time these moments happen, the death sequence is just the last part. It's not the whole story. All these other things that lead to the death sequence are as formative. They constitute not just the context in which people die, but the very people whose identities, whose tendencies, whose practices, whose biases create the death sequence, right? So, and it's not just who George Floyd is, right? It's who the officers are. It's who Darnella Frazier is. It's who the store owner is, and that's why the roots of this are so important to understand. That's why we can never do a drive. Pardon the pun, but we can never do it, or the expression. We can never do a drive-by kind of journalism piece on this, right? It's not enough to do the cable news approach of saying the who, what, when, where, and why of the death sequence. The point of this book is to say these death sequences are just a slice of the story.
Well, and one of the quotes in your book that I have written down conveniently was my next question. But one of the things you say is a shooting is an instant, a lynching is a performance. Yeah. When did you realize the story of George Floyd was not just the story of George Floyd, but the story of how the recording of that performance had changed?
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
Well, I'll speak to that. I think it... that's the first word of the book, right? I mean, why? Why did George Floyd and the recording of George Floyd matter in ways that the killing of Walter Scott did not in South Carolina, which was a shooting? Why did it not create the same level of uproar that Trayvon Martin did, that Michael Brown did, that that so many stories that have happened in the past few years? And I think the dynamic you mentioned there is related to it. The fact that it was not a 1 second event, that it happened over 9 minutes and 29 seconds, meant that it was an excruciating death. It had the quality of a crucifixion. It had the quality of a lynching. I mean, you know this from the book, but we go into some depth about the role of lynching in American history and how these were performances themselves. They were done often in town squares with crowds there who would show up, and pictures were taken and sent as postcards to friends who couldn't make it, or to relatives the other side of the country. There was this sense that it was a performance in a kind of ridding the country of this evil presence, as extra legal as it was tolerated throughout the South. So the killing of George Floyd had the quality of a lynching. It had the quality of a crucifixion. At the same time, it had the quality of a kind of sculptural statement. It was, I think we say in the book that it was both had the filmic quality of narrative, and that it played out over time, but it also had the sculptural and symbolic role that still photography has, in that it was a single image, a white man, with his knee in the neck of a black man lying on the pavement next to the tire of a police cruiser. The man is a police officer. He's got his hand in his pocket. He's looking nonchalantly away, even as people are pummeling him with questions and demands that he take the knee off the neck of George Floyd. The symbolic quality of that. I mean, people have been saying, as Marc said, that get the knee off my. Black people have been saying for decades. What does the Negro want, as they said in the 1960s? And James Baldwin responded by saying, we want you to get your knee off our neck. So that has resonance, this image. The video had the quality of theater. The image had deep historical resonance. And I think we both felt that was so important to the way that the story unfolded, and the way that it captured the imagination of the world. And it was that brought us together on a phone call back 2 years ago to when Mark and I were saying, well, what is it about this? And the fact that we could point to the technology playing that role, to the theater of it playing a role, was what inspired this book.
I was going to ask, how do you two know each other? I like to get behind the book a little bit here and find out the process that authors use. So how do you two know each other? How did you decide to write a book together? And how did that, that might be more of a commitment than marriage is. I mean, writing a book together, I can't even imagine, is, grabbing the pen from one another. No, this is the way we should do. How did that process work? How do you form an argument between two writers? And is there ever disagreement between two writers?
That's a great question. Many people ask the how do you know each other part, but most don't ask the process questions that you just asked, which I think are incredibly interesting. In fact, you may be the first person to have asked us that.
I think you are. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, I'll take it. All right.
So first, the simple part is Todd and I met. We share an agent, and so we met some years ago. Each of us were working on different projects, and we put our heads together and we talked about working together. And I think what we immediately realized from the moment we met was that we shared a respect for each other's work, and admiration for each other's ideas and writing. And we never stopped talking about what the book would be that we'd co-author. To be honest, I thought it'd be a book on race and sports. That was sort of where I was leaning. That's why I had hoped we'd go. And it was like when the time works out. Then in 2020, as Todd alluded to, George Floyd was killed, and we were trying to make sense of it. Our faithful agent definitely called us again and said, hey, you two need to do something. But I think Todd and I both have a level of integrity with regard to our work that we wouldn't force something that didn't make sense. We wouldn't force a project. But as we talked through the George Floyd, I sort of the idea of George Floyd, not just as someone who was killed by the police, but as someone who was a signpost of a bigger set of issues, a bigger set of shifts, both in the media, in technology, and in how this country processes race. We said this is the idea, and then we talked through the book. We outlined the book, and there were ideas and chapters that I came up with right away. There were ideas and chapters that Todd came up with right away, and we sketched those out as we wrote the proposal. And others kind of developed other things that we thought would loom larger in the book. I'll give you an example. We thought initially the story of Christian Cooper and Amy Cooper in Central Park, the bird watcher. I thought this is a perfect story, and it's a great story, and it makes its way into our conversations sometimes about the book. But that was a story that we decided to pull back on. But we definitely have a lot more about Kyle Rittenhouse than we'd initially talked about. And the other thing is, when you're writing a book about state violence in a violent state, is that stuff happens while you're writing it. And so new stories emerge, new things become more relevant, other things become less central. And then from there, and Todd, I'm sure has something to say about this too, but in terms of, do you have disagree? I think if you write a book with someone, unless you're writing a polemic type book, I think you kind of have to be on the same page ideologically, politically, etc. Now, I am probably, I think it's safe to say I'm further to the left than Todd is on certain issues, particularly around state violence. I mean, I'm an abolitionist. Todd wouldn't identify as an abolitionist, and so sometimes there are moments where we push back against each other in terms of our language or in terms of the argument we're making to make sure both of our perspectives are represented. There are times where we add nuance and depth to each other's work. I mean, co-authoring, in my estimation, is as much about being a good writer as it is about being a good editor and being a good reader.
Do you go back and forth with, okay, I wrote this page, or I wrote this chapter, this paragraph, do you want to look at it? Or do you just take it and send it to the agent or the editor, and then they distill it?
Nothing is written that we both didn't look at, feel good about, edit, etc. Todd may draft something and then I edit, tweak, add my pieces, etc. Or, for example, but I think neither of us would feel good if it just got sent off. but I think these processes work better when a chapter is written by a person and then the other person, does that. So you can go back and forth with chapters, but I think in general it's better if somebody writes a draft after we both sketch out an idea than to kind of, I write this paragraph, you write that paragraph, just for consistency and continuity of the writing style.
So I would add that there needs a couple of things. One, and I think your listeners will be very interested to know that I'd say about 80% of the work goes into the concept for the book.
Yes.
It's the draft. It's like think of it the way that an architect might work. They would know the situation, they would know the geography, they would know all the aspects, the materials, and then they would create a blueprint for the building they're going to build. Now, as they build it, it organically changes, right? So that as the things become clear to them in the building process, and in our case in the writing process, we would begin to change things. We might discover that we need. I mean, a great example is the tone of the second chapter. The lead to the second chapter is an idea that Marc brought to me that I had no idea of, which is the story of Janiqua Charles. And Marc, maybe you should tell this, because I think it's a great episode. It's a great demonstration, I should say, of our themes without being a front of the of the conversation story about race in America during the time when it was happening. But tell the story of Janiqua, because I think it's important.
Janiqua Charles is a really fascinating woman. She was outside of a gentleman's club, and she was trying to go back in, she says, to get her purse or whatever, and security would not let her in. And after some pushback, they end up holding her and handcuffing her. And she sees a camera, and she starts to say to the officer, she's protesting her detainment, and it turns into a song and ultimately a dance. Many people saw it on Twitter or on Instagram or TikTok, right? She's saying, "You about to lose your job. You about to lose your job. You about to lose your job because you are detaining me for nothing," right? So it goes from this, so it becomes this amazing clip that's hilarious to people. It goes viral. It gets remixed. People make videos to it.
I remembered it when I came across it. I was like, "Oh, I remember that."
Yeah. And she is suddenly a social media kind of spectacle. And there's so many layers in this. First of all, the fact that she was being detained but felt an amount of safety and democratic possibility because the camera was there, right? Saying "you about to lose your job" speaks to the way that the viral moment and everything from the campaign, right, which we talk about in the book, to doxing, when we think about even the Amy Cooper thing, that all these possibilities emerge when people have access to these technologies to democratize the process. And then, as we talk about in the book, she also falls further victim to addiction, which she's already struggling with. She's detached from her family. She doesn't even know that she's a social media spectacle as this stuff is happening. She finds out much later. And so there's a way that her story speaks to these structural issues. It speaks to the possibilities of social media, but also the limitations of it. And suddenly she is the soundtrack to Donald Trump being pushed out of office, right? And much in the way that Kendrick Lamar's "All Right" was the soundtrack to Ferguson Summer. And so these texts get used in ways that we can't even anticipate. It's like the whole postmodern or post-structural notion of the death of the author, right? It's suddenly the meaning that the author gives to it isn't necessarily the way that it gets taken up by people. And so all of this is happening, and it's a fascinating idea. And so when we were starting to draft ideas for the book, I think this was maybe the first idea after George Floyd, which of course was the heart. I was like, we got to do Darnella Frazier. So that was the chapter that I developed because it was so, I think, important to how we think about these issues.
I'm really curious.
If you come off of the story of George Floyd and you go to that story of Janiqua Charles, they have parallels, right? I mean, because Derek Chauvin ends up losing his job because the camera was there to record it. I'm sorry, but
no, that's okay. I'm curious about this. What obstacles or benefits did you encounter doing this project as a Black author and as a white author? How did that impact your book and the writing of your book?
Go ahead, Todd.
Well, first of all, we were we wanted to take advantage of the fact that we are a Black author and a white author. And the original title for the book was Black and White, which was meant to have a resonance with the film industry. It turns out there were other books called Black and White, including one from our publisher, so they didn't really want to go with that title again, and probably rightly so. We didn't want to make that too much a part of the story, but I think it's an important one in that this is not a Black book, it's not a white book, it's a book for people of all color and all shapes and all races, and its message is integral to the experience of all races. I think for me, as a white author, a white journalist, white historian, for me, the experience of writing the book, in a sense, is the experience that that the readers have, I hope, which is I became so much more deeply acquainted with the story of race in America as it was exhibited into popular culture, as it was exhibited in technology and film.
See, because I'm sorry to cut you off, but I have a very hard time. I don't know exactly how to say this, but I have a hard time talking about race in America, knowing that I'm a white person and can never know what it is truly like to be Black. I can read about it over and over and over, and I can watch the documentaries and read the books, but there's always a part of me that this is maybe the only subject in my life, other than maybe what it's like to give birth, where I really have to remind myself that I simply cannot know what it is like to be in the shoes of a Black person in America. And that makes me reticent sometimes to fully express myself, because I know that I cannot speak with a certain authority on it.
But you can observe, and that's what journalists do, right? That's what historians do. I mean, the fact that Marc and I are working together, we can fill in the blanks for each other in a certain sense, I think. No, I mean, I don't think you, through this experience, that I came to know in the way that you're describing it, right? Mm-hmm. What it is like to be a Black man in America. I want to hear Marc speak to that.
Yeah.
But I do think that I came closer to understanding it. And I became more humbled by it, which I think parallels the experience of well-intentioned white Americans today in the years that we're chronicling here about the experience of technology, social media, and their role in racial justice. Marc, what do you think?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think if we were writing a book about what it means to be Black in America, I would have probably not worked with Todd on the project. Right?
You might have chosen someone else.
Right. That there may have been better candidates.
Maybe.
But I think, our goal was to do something, I think, more important and interesting. Not more important. Let me take that back. What we were attempting to do was something more interesting to us at this juncture. There are plenty of brilliant people who write at the personal level and about race and link that personal analysis to a deep intellectual engagement. Think about Ta-Nehisi Coates, right? For example, Between the World and Me is a masterpiece. When I think about that kind of stuff, Kiese Layman's Heavy, maybe one of the best memoirs of the last 50 years, help us do that. Darnell Moore, Amani Perry, it's et cetera, have all done that. And Bell Hooks, is our patron saint of sort of memoir and analysis. I think as journalists, as scholars, we wanted to help tell a story. As a historian, I think one of Todd's primary intellectual commitments is documenting change over time and helping us understand how the conversation on race technology has shifted over time. For me, I find that compelling, although I'm not a historian. As an anthropologist, our goal is to make the familiar strange and the strange familiar, to take things that we are deeply engaged in and embedded in, even, right? Think about Zora Neale Hurston and her anthropological writing, and to look at it through different eyes with some distance, right? With some distance, and then to make the familiar strange, and then to take things that are distant to us, things that we are not natives to, and get to understand it from a more, we call emic or internal perspective. It doesn't mean we go native. It doesn't mean we become the people, but it means that we look at it through different eyes. And so I think in this case, we're both doing it as historians, but we're also, I'm trying to make the familiar strange. I think Todd is making the strange familiar in each of these, not just these cases, but these broader conversation about race. But I think the other piece of this to remember is, while Todd doesn't know what it's like to be Black, and I don't know what it's like to be white, we both know what it's like to have a race. And too often in the United States, when we say race talk, that becomes code for talking about Black people. When we say gender, we really just mean talking about women, right? When we say we're going to talk about sexuality, we don't usually mean straight people, right? So there's a way that I think, by even engaging the question of race as a white man, Todd is doing an important political act, which is to recognize that whiteness is an identity, whiteness is a race, whiteness must be outed, whiteness must be accounted for as a site of power, as a normative space. And I think that's important. And I think that plays out in our work, both in terms of our units of analysis, what we choose to look at, but also in the more subtle nuanced things. Like, for example, when we're writing and we shift our language from slave to enslaved person, right? That's a very important shift when we choose our references, right? Who are we citing as authorities here? These are all political acts that I think we push each other back and forth on. It's not like I'm there as the race police telling Todd, you need more Black people, or Todd's like, Marc, you're being too insular or tribalistic. It's that we're pushing each other to think beyond our sort of intuitive boundaries.
My mind goes to the beating of Rodney King as the first piece of surveillance video to make a major splash. I'm sure there was something before that, but in my head, maybe that's because I'm a kid of the early 80s. So by the time it was 89 or 90, or I guess, 89, that was, when I was starting to become a conscious person. So is the Rodney King the first video to make a splash? At least I remember when I first started hearing about it, you couldn't just go see it. You couldn't just go find it. You had to wait for it to be played somewhere. So how do the types of videos that we see, whether it's body cam or static surveillance camera, or in the case of Rodney King, a home movie camera that someone went and grabbed, Facebook Live, eyewitness video, how does the medium become the message when it comes to videos of these kinds of things happening?
It was 91, I think, on the
91.
92, I think, was the trial. Am I right about that, Marc?
And the uprisings, yeah. So we just celebrated the
30th anniversary of the verdict, and it's interesting because you can tell by looking at that landing point and forward to this landing point, the passage of 30 years, what it meant for those 30 years in terms of how life has changed and developed in America. The fellow who took that video was had ambitions to be a videographer himself. I believe he was an immigrant, and his side gig was as a plumber, and he just ordered some new equipment, which arrived, I think, that day. And he was in a high-rise apartment. I'm sure he was living there or visiting someone, but he took the camera out to just sort of try it. And when he looked through the lens, he saw Rodney King being beaten. I mean, what are the chances of that? That video, though, was the first experience of sort of the innocent capture excuse me, of photographs, of video, of imagery that told the story that Black people have been telling for a long, long time. Fast forward 30 years, now it's not somebody who has professional ambitions to be a journalist or a videographer who has special equipment. It's somebody who's got a cell phone in their pocket. The case of Darnella Frazier, who was the teenager walking down the street in Minneapolis, pulled on her way to Cup Foods to buy snacks for her sister, little sister, who pulls out her phone and records this courageously. That shows the democratization of video. And I think when you say the medium is the message, of course, which is the Marshall McLuhan line, I'm loath to put too much attention on that, except to say that the gathering of the video, in the case of of Rodney King, transmitted our first experience, it seems to me, with how random video and random imagery taken without intention. It wasn't that anyone went out looking to take the video of a beating of the police officer, or even to chronicle the story of police officers keeping the peace in Los Angeles. It was somebody who accidentally came upon this, which also suggests how pervasive this experience was, right? And then we go 30 years later, and we have now the pervasive nature of the cell phone camera being in everyone's pocket. And we now have multiple instances every few weeks. It seems we got new video. We have new video last week from Akron of the killing or violence against people of color, and having it in such graphic detail keeps the story front and center. Means that the message, the medium, is the message that this is ubiquitous, and we need to do something about it.
What event do you folks wish there was video of? I wish that there was video of Trayvon Martin and that incident. Reading your discussion of Trayvon and Emmett Till, kind of went back and forth between them. Can you compare and contrast those particular incidents for us here? Because, I know that Emmett Till, when the picture finally surfaced, there was suddenly an outcry over that. And I remember when Trayvon Martin's pictures were leaked by somebody, and those were really hard to see. And of course, I'm wearing a hoodie right now. I never would have been followed through that apartment through that neighborhood, no matter how hard I tried to be followed. If you can compare and contrast those two and explain why you put those together as part of your argument.
One thing I think we need to think about when we talk about Emmett Till, Emmett Till is a very fascinating sort of story of race in America and the possibilities of it. August 28th, 1955, Emmett Till is killed. And it's a lynching. And that boy from Chicago killed in Mississippi was beaten so brutally, his head multiple times its normal size from the swelling, and it beaten to a point where he was beaten so grotesquely that you couldn't recognize his own face. People who knew him couldn't really recognize him. And his mother, Mamie Till, was a courageous woman who had a vision that extended beyond her own situation. She said, I'm going to have an open casket funeral. The open casket is a tactic. It's a strategy. It's a political maneuver. Very similar to Dr. King having us get beaten on the Pettus Bridge. The spectacle of violence and ultimately the spectacle of death is what brought America in. Mamie Till used the technology of the day, the camera, and the media of the day. There was no TikTok or Twitter, but there was the Chicago Defender. There was the New York Times. There was Jet Magazine. You talk about Black Twitter. Yeah, you had Jet Magazine. And so the media and technology of the day was used to draw attention and to create a spectacle that would produce a reaction. And so August 28th, 1955 gets us into the Montgomery bus boycotts. It gets us into the next phase of our civil rights struggle, so that August 28th, 1955 gets us to August 28th, 1963, March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Sort of interesting connection there, right? So in that way, the story of Trayvon or the story of Mike Brown or the story of any of these stories, right, speaks to the parallel there, I believe, is the way that technology and social media is used. When we saw Mike Brown in Canfield laid out for 4.5 hours, we didn't need Jet Magazine anymore. We didn't have to wait for the next week's Jet because we had Twitter and Facebook. We could see it right away. But it was still the spectacle of violence and the spectacle of death that was intended to disrupt the sensibilities of everyday folk, right? Now, Dr. King did it strategically and tactically Mamie Till didn't want her boy to die. Mike Brown didn't Senior and didn't want his son to die. But in each way, the violence led to the use of media and technology as a way of helping get justice. And the difference, I think, is that there was a moment where it took happenstance. It took a stroke of luck. It took a plumber and wannabe videographer to catch it. It took a determined mother whose son was lynched to do it. Now we have these tools at our disposal. We have the phones, we have the streams, we have the stuff where we can be agents in our own freedom, in much the way Dr. King modeled, right? But we don't need to be civil rights leaders, and we don't need the technology of the evening news. We can do it with our own phones, and I think that speaks to this issue.
One of the things about being a new parent is that sometimes you got to go quickly. And I know what that's like. And Mark is finding out what that's like too. His baby is howling. We're going to let him go. Mark, thanks for being here. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Make sure you take care of that baby.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for being here. Todd, let's have you compare and contrast the killing of Ahmaud Arbery and the Birth of a Nation movie from the 1910s, and why you found that those echoed in very similar fashion.
Yeah, I think it's important actually to even extend it back before the Birth of a Nation, just the Civil War, because of course the Birth of a Nation is a movie about the Civil War, and we'll come to that in a second. But Ahmaud Arbery was killed on a citizen's arrest on the basis for his killers claimed that they had the right to track him down and to attempt to arrest him, which is the scene which eventually leads to his killing, was based upon a 1863 Georgia law that conveniently arrived only a few months after the Emancipation Proclamation. And the purpose of the law, of course, was to track down and prevent the departure of slaves fleeing their enslavement in response to the Emancipation Proclamation. So we have a very interesting echo already right there, right? Which is that the pursuit of Ahmaud Arbery in three white men in trucks coming, pursuing a man who is running, and they're doing it on the basis of an 1863 Georgia law intended to capture fugitive slaves, already gives us the echoes of the Civil War. But The Birth of a Nation, for your listeners who don't know, is a movie, one of the great movies really in terms of the advancement of the medium. Was introduced in 1915, was a movie done by a director named D.W. Griffith, one of the great pioneers in the film industry, and a Southerner from Kentucky, based the story of the film on the writings of Thomas Dixon, a white supremacist author, and on the movement to reconsider the story of the Civil War, not as the North succeeding because they had the greater moral purpose and end to slavery, but that they succeeded over the South only because they had greater numbers and more money to fund their fight, but that the South had the greater moral principle, which was states' rights, the freedom of the individual, the freedom of contract, which they attached to the authors of the Constitution. The story told in The Birth of a Nation is the story of two families, two white families, one northern, one southern, who are separated by the war, and are separated by the messages by the arrival of the black race in America, which has only led to bad things. That the Civil War was really stoked by the black slave population being here, had disrupted the relationship between the white Northerners and the white Southerners, and that only the banishment of the white race the black race from positions of power could possibly lead to the reconnecting of America with its founding principles. Those ideas that were put forward in the movie, and which helped to stoke the myth of the lost cause, which is what it's called, which was dominant in American historical telling in the mid 20th century. This was also the attitude that the that the McMichaels father and son took with them on their chase of Ahmaud Arbery through the streets of Glynn County, Georgia, for his having invaded a white neighborhood, essentially. Today, the two McMichaels brothers and their companion are looking at long prison times for their actions, having been recorded by a video camera.
And of course, that would not have happened during the times of Birth of a Nation. It would have been, in quotes, just another lynching.
Absolutely. This was the height of the lynching era. In fact, the ads for the movie appeared in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution next to ads for recruiting for the Ku Klux Klan.
We often talk about Blacks being products of history. Dr. Marc certainly alluded to this. But how were the killers of Ahmaud Arbery products of their history in Georgia?
Well, I don't know enough about the ancestral history of the McMichaels father and son to go beyond that one generation. But I do know that the interesting thing about the Arbery case was, as I said, this 1863 law that they were basing their power to be able to detain him was on, and that the fact that the entire prosecutor's office had rejected the idea of prosecuting the McMichaels on the basis of their reading of that law and their basis of reading the actions of the McMichaels father and son. If it had not been for social media, if it had not been for the passing of the word of outrage that Ahmaud Arbery was killed and that his killers were not facing justice, if that had not happened, which built a campaign to bring the case to prosecution, the Ahmaud Arbery's killers were probably gone free.
I watched the surveillance, not the surveillance video. I watched the body cam video, thanks to your discussion of it in your book. I had never seen it before. And it's pretty, I guess, wild is the term I would use colloquially here. But, it's pretty incredible to see the McMichaels looking around at the officers, kind of looking for a shoulder to cry on, saying, I didn't have any choice. I mean, he came at me. I just had no choice. And the other guy kind of says, oh, you didn't have a choice, did you? You didn't have a choice, did you? And the officers are like, no, I understand that. I can't even imagine what you've just been through. We're going to get you some water and get you cleaned up. And the sympathy immediately went to him. And I'm not suggesting the officers didn't care about the death that had taken place, but there was something instinctual to find sympathy in what the McMichaels had just been through, as opposed to what Ahmaud Arbery.
While their attention was being consumed with consoling the McMichaels, Ahmaud Arbery was bleeding out. I mean, it took so long.
You hear him sigh. Yeah, you hear him
exactly. Yeah. And the attention is on whether the McMichaels are traumatized by the experience of killing this young man, rather than on the young man himself.
Let's go a little bit further back. We talked Birth of a Nation here. Let's go back to the 1800s just a little bit. Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth. There is a chapter in the book about them. You and many others have argued that they spurred the media of their day. What does their writing suggest about how information on racial justice traveled in the 1800s when they were in their prime?
Well, the interesting thing about him, most of your listeners probably don't know this, but Frederick Douglass was the most photographed man of the 19th century, most photographed American of the 19th century, more so than Abraham Lincoln. And one of the I'll give you two reasons. One was Douglass's own desire to be photographed. He was fascinated by photography, felt that photography would be a great agent to racial justice. You might ask why? Well, the country was in a time when pseudoscience was relegating the race to a kind of racial hierarchy, where Black people were considered to be not far from being classified as animals. The idea that Frederick Douglass could sit in a position of dignity, in a pose of dignity before a camera, and that picture could be disseminated throughout the country in order to show that this former slave, a man who grew up with no training by no means was a man as much as the next man, white though he may be, black though he may be, was a dramatic statement in the cause of racial justice. Another reason why he was photographed so much, though, was that there was a fascination for him in that he had been a slave. In fact, when he would go in his life in the North on abolition speaking tours, the question he got most often was, what is it like to feel the sting of the whip? What is it like to be put in chains? And the fascination in a kind of, as if this was an exotic demonstration of a life. So when it came to Frederick Douglass, the sitting for pictures, writing his autobiography, was a big part of his statement of the dignity of the race. W.E.B. Du Bois calls upon it again, photography, and when he puts the exhibition together for the Paris Exposition at the turn of the century, and is asked to show a gallery of photographs of Black life in America, he chooses the photographs of ordinary people in order to be able to show, again, their dignity. Sojourner Truth would pass out these little cards with their own image on it, knowing that, asking you to see the shadow along with the substance. In other words, to go beyond the image itself to see the dignity of her life. So technology was a big part of their message to the country and to the world.
Does video accurately record events, or are we too biased to absorb them in a constructive way?
The way I teach journalism is to instill in my students a respect for skepticism. And I think it's very important that we, as consumers of video and consumers of news, approach what we see with a certain skepticism, not a cynicism, but a skepticism. The skepticism is different from a cynicism, is that cynicism suggests that we're all being manipulated and every teller's story is biased in a way that distorts the truth. Skepticism looks upon video and asks, what is it I'm seeing? What is it that I'm not seeing? What is it about the camera that it's taken in this rectangular image and not the image to the right or the left of it or behind the videographer? We also, there's a healthy amount of skepticism, asks that we look upon what we're viewing with some help of a curatorial voice. And that is a curatorial voice that we respect and that we believe shares the values that we share. Naturally, if we're looking at the story of Kyle Rittenhouse as filmed by one, or even more as produced by a documentary filmmaker, in order to tell a story that is sympathetic to Kyle Rittenhouse, we have to be suspicious of the way the story is told. If the video is not manipulated, we can still end up taking some truths away from it. But we recognize that the way the story is being told, it's being told in order to communicate a certain point of view about it, what it is that the videographer has seen. If that videographer does not share our values, then we might be more suspicious of it, skeptical of it.
One of the conclusions your book makes is that the impact of technology is not necessarily an experience anymore. Technology is simply where we live. These videos in this online world is now a location for us. That could be seen as a negative thing, but you also argue that could be another chance for us to try to get this right.
The last chapter of the book is called Another Chance, and it makes the observation, begins with the observation that that technology our technology in our own moment is to enter into a new virtual existence. It also makes the point that every time that the nation's history has shifted from in the acquiring of new property, was the Northwest Territories that were at issue with that led this, and then whether slavery will be allowed there or not, that led to the Civil War. Similarly, in our own time, the acquiring of new property means we have to set the rules for new property. And so we have another chance to be able to reshape our racial story in the metasphere. The positives are in our ability to have another chance. The negatives, of course, are that we will ultimately recommit the same sins we've committed in the past.
How do we get this book into the hands of those who need to read it most?
Everyone should read it and buy it and read it.
Yes. Everyone should definitely buy it.
I'll say that. I mean, those of you who know the publishing business know that authors don't make much money at all on their books. This is really not about making money. If we wanted to make money, we would be in a different profession. Both Marc and I believe very strongly that the ideas that are in this book need to be disseminated and understood and talked about. And I'm a big supporter of the First Amendment. I'm a big supporter of the public conversation. I think that we should be using our reading in order to engage with others around us. We should be, the book should be part of book groups. It should be part of library reads. It should be, we had a conversation this morning about a law firm that wants to adopt the book and have it as a firm-wide read for all their lawyers. I think it's the best way the books are brought to the attention of others is through word of mouth. And so I'm grateful to you, Evan, and others for your willingness to bring us on and talk about the book and stoke the interest in people to go out and get it.
The dedication of the book was interesting to me, or at least was very well put. You said, "May seeing bring learning, and may learning bring justice." Does advancement of knowledge always bring justice?
No, but that is really a tip to the notion of another chance. We spoke about it before. If we're seeing more than we've seen in the past, if we're seeing things that remained unseen to us for so long, let these things that we see be agents of justice, that they push us into a better world and a better country and a better people, that they don't continue to divide us, and they don't resurrect old corrupt ideologies that we need to be free from.
How is business for both of you? I wish Marc was still here. I wanted to ask how he was doing. How is everything for you? What are you working on these days?
Well, I have another book coming out next year, as a matter of fact. It's a book largely driven by photographs. It's an archival book on the history of the American child, and it uses pictures from the Library of Congress and from the Metropolitan Museum of Art and from the Magnum Photo Agency, and tells the history of the American child on the notion that America is really where we invented childhood. I'll leave that phrase out there for when you'll call me back to come on.
There you go.
A year from now, or it comes out in May of 2023. So I've just been wrapping that up. I have been teaching at Mount Holyoke College, journalism there. I'm not teaching at the moment, but I was during most of the past couple of years. Marc is teaching at Temple. Marc has another book of lectures that he's coming out with. He asked me to take a look at it this morning, which I'm excited to read. And Marc's got his new baby is in the house, so he's got a lot of business at home.
I wanted to ask him about his bookstore. What do you know about Uncle Bobby's bookstore?
Uncle Bobby's is a wonderful little independent bookstore, and I'll put this plug out there for independent bookstores all around the country. We're speaking at R.J. Julia at the end of the month, a wonderful independent bookstore on the east coast of Connecticut. But there's many wonderful independent bookstores around the country, and Uncle Bobby's, which is named for Marc's uncle, who instilled the love of reading in him, is a bookstore in Philly that you all should go to if you're in the city. And it's wonderful to be working with an author who actually runs a bookstore, because he knows what bookstore owners go through, and I think he also knows how many people out there just love the act of reading. How
do you feel when you walk into a bookstore?
I feel excited. I'm always looking for a chair because I know I'm going to be there a long time. And I look for things that I didn't know were being published. I love the serendipity of it. I think that's one of the things that we miss out on with buying books on Amazon and other .com sites, because you can't sort of wander as easily as you can in a bookstore. And I also think the wonderful thing about bookstores is that they are display cases too. I mean, the cover of a book is a wonderful thing to behold. I mean, there's a whole design sense behind it that what you discover. It's like I was trying to tell my younger son who's started to get into vinyl, just how the beauty of a record jacket is to
what's vinyl?
That's right. And how that packaging of a sort of artistic product, something that's it's not just the music, it's the liner notes, it's the cover art, it's the and the same thing is true of books, right? I mean, to have something and hold it in your hand and put it in your bag and to bring it to a friend's house and to give it as a gift. We don't get to give gifts of books as much anymore because we're buying so many electronic things for electronic devices. So I love bookstores, I do. And I love what they do for communities too. The bookstore here in Richfield, Connecticut, Books on the Common, which is an independent bookstore, is a terrific bookstore and a great supporter of public events and of book groups and of sort of the books that their own employees are reading are always up front and center. So it's a real community center.
Dr. Marc Lamont Hill and Todd Brewster, the authors of Seen and Unseen: Technology, Social Media, and the Fight for Racial Justice. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Really enjoyed it, Evan.
So did I. Check out the book. Check out their Twitter feeds, which are at Marc Lamont Hill and at Todd Brewster. Also check out Dr. Hill's bookstore at UncleBobby's.com. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports, History, and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. We'll see you next time. Thanks.